Just before the Australian Grand Prix, a major controversy was brewing in Formula One, one that had been quietly developing behind the scenes. The FIA wasn't the first to take a closer look at the issue of flexible rear wings, often referred to as mini DRS. Before the opening race of the season, both teams and fans believed this concept had been left in the past. However, McLaren's introduction of it in Baku last year reignited discussions throughout the winter. In response, the FIA decided to tighten regulations, introducing stricter tests to ensure compliance. It seemed like the matter was settled, until last weekend. Despite the newly enforced rules, some teams were still caught using illegal rear wings. As a result, the FIA acted swiftly after the Melbourne race, implementing even tougher technical restrictions. These new measures are expected to have a significant impact, particularly on McLaren, Mercedes, and Ferrari. But the biggest question remains, has this given Red Bull an edge once again? With these new regulations in place, have they finally managed to eliminate one of their biggest concerns? And why is the FIA taking such extreme action now? Formula One has always operated in a space where regulations leave room for interpretation. Teams constantly push boundaries to extract maximum performance, often walking a fine line between what's allowed and what can be cleverly manipulated. Flexi wings were initially expected to fall within this gray area, with teams believing they had found a way to work around the rules. However, as pressure from rival teams increased, the FIA had no choice but to respond with tougher restrictions. Over the winter, the FIA faced mounting pressure to close loopholes in the regulations. Some teams were suspected of taking advantage of flexible aerodynamic components, prompting officials to introduce stricter measures. Initially, the plan was to implement these new restrictions by the Spanish Grand Prix, giving teams time to adjust. However, after recent findings in Australia, the FIA decided immediate action was necessary. To tackle the issue, the FIA introduced additional monitoring methods, including new cameras focused on rear wing movement during the opening race weekend. What they discovered forced them to act without delay. The findings suggested that some teams had developed ways to pass the static tests while still gaining an aerodynamic advantage on track. Traditionally, the FIA has relied on stationary load tests to check for excessive wing flexing. However, certain teams seem to have figured out how to design their wings in a way that met these requirements while still benefiting from flexibility under race conditions. This led to an urgent revision of technical regulations, with new limits being introduced immediately. One of the key rule changes involved Articles 3.15.1.7 and 3.1.5.12b, which govern rear wing movement. The adjustments included tighter restrictions on static tests, which took effect at the Australian Grand Prix. Initially, these checks didn't raise any major red flags, as all cars passed inspection. However, during pre-season testing in Bahrain, FIA officials noticed certain teams might still be bending the rules, leading to an even stricter approach. To put an end to the issue, the FIA made a decisive move, installing high-resolution cameras to track rear-wing behavior in real time. These cameras captured crucial evidence during the Australian Grand Prix, revealing patterns of movement that had previously gone unnoticed. The results were concerning enough for the FIA to take further action, leading to a stricter enforcement of the regulations. The most significant change came with the modification of Article 3.15.1.7, which specifically addresses the slot gap test between the main plane and the adjustable wing flap. Previously, teams were allowed a 2 mm gap under a force of 750 newtons while the car was stationary. However, from the Chinese Grand Prix onward, this limit has been dramatically reduced to just 0.25 mm. Given the short notice, a 0.25 mm tolerance will be permitted for the Shanghai race only, allowing teams a brief adjustment period before the full enforcement of the new rule. This test involves applying vertical pressure to the left and right sides of the rear wing structure, measuring any unintended movement. For teams relying on flexible aero components, this is a major setback. Reducing the permissible movement by 75% will significantly impact top speeds, especially for those who had been optimizing their setups around this loophole. The expected outcome: some cars may struggle to match their previous straight-line performance, leading to noticeable shifts in the competitive order. With this change, top teams like McLaren, Mercedes, and Ferrari may find themselves at a disadvantage. The question now is, who stands to gain the most from these revisions? And more importantly, did Red Bull anticipate these changes and design their car accordingly? The impact of these changes became clear when analyzing the data from Australia. Before the stricter regulations, teams were able to achieve a noticeable speed boost using their rear wings. The DRS effect created a speed difference between a closed and open flap, resulting in an average gain of 23 km/h. Specifically, Mercedes gained 124 km/h. McLaren and Red Bull saw 123 km/h, while Ferrari registered 122 km/h. These numbers highlighted just how much teams were relying on aerodynamic flexibility to maximize straight-line performance. Now, with the FIA slashing the allowable wing movement, that advantage is set to disappear. This means that any team that was heavily relying on this feature will now face a significant drop in top speed. The 75% reduction in allowable flex will leave little room for adjustment, forcing teams to rethink their aerodynamic strategies. Moving forward. Interestingly, while these regulations are not directly targeting a single team, the effects won't be felt equally across the grid. Some teams may have already adjusted their designs, anticipating these changes, while others, particularly McLaren, could be hit the hardest. The FIA's approach suggests they are more focused on eliminating excessive deflections rather than singling out any specific competitor. Despite these efforts, the debate surrounding flexible wings is far from over. Even with the new rules in place, there are still ways for teams to find creative solutions within the gray areas of the regulations. However, one thing is certain: the FIA's aggressive stance is making it harder for teams to exploit aerodynamic loopholes, and this could reshape the competitive balance in the coming races. Following the FIA's official statement, it became evident that these changes had been in the works for some time. Between the end of the 2024 season and the beginning of 2025, the governing body had already planned to introduce tougher load deflection tests for both the front and rear wings. Initially, these adjustments were set to take effect by round 9 in Spain, but after analyzing rear wing deformations during the Australian Grand Prix, the FIA determined that immediate intervention was necessary. To ensure fair competition, teams were required to use onboard cameras during free practice sessions to monitor their cars' behavior. The footage revealed clear inconsistencies between static deflection tests conducted in the FIA garage and what was happening on track. This evidence provided enough justification for a stricter enforcement of Article 315(1.7, which governs wing flexibility. Under the revised rule, if 75 kg of vertical force is applied to either side of the rear wing's main plane, the distance between the main plane and the flap must not change by more than 0.5 mm. This marks a dramatic reduction from the previous 2 mm limit, which had been in place before the Australian Grand Prix. However, to accommodate the sudden rule change, teams will be granted a 0.25 mm tolerance for the Shanghai race only before the stricter enforcement kicks in fully. On Monday, March 17th, all teams were formally notified about the revised regulations, with the FIA confirming that all cars in Melbourne had passed the existing tests and were deemed legal at the time. However, going forward, these new restrictions will ensure that no team gains an unfair advantage through excessive wing flexibility. Now the real question is, will this enforcement actually shake up the competitive order? Or have some teams already adapted, leaving their rivals scrambling to catch up? With these new regulations in place, The biggest mystery now is how they will impact the pecking order in Formula One. While it is no secret that McLaren was among the first teams to push the boundaries of aeroelasticity, that doesn't necessarily mean they will be the most affected. Over the winter break, the team had hinted that tighter regulations weren't a major concern for them. However, the timing of this enforcement could make a huge difference. Initially, the stricter tests were supposed to be introduced at the Spanish Grand Prix, Round 9, allowing teams ample time to make adjustments. Instead, the FIA's decision to enforce these changes immediately at the Chinese Grand Prix has forced teams into rushed modifications, which could have unpredictable consequences. For teams that were already pushing the limits of the regulations, this abrupt shift could lead to reduced top speeds and compromised aerodynamic efficiency. On the other hand, teams that were playing it safe may benefit, as their rivals are forced to adjust mid-season. One team that could potentially gain an advantage is Red Bull. Their technical director, Pierre Wache, had been vocal about teams exploiting the mini DRS effect during pre-season testing. He specifically pointed out that McLaren and Ferrari were still using techniques to gain speed on the straights. Given that Red Bull was the first to raise concerns, it is likely that their RB21 car was designed to comply with the upcoming regulations from the start. If that's the case, they could be one step ahead of the competition. However, until the Chinese Grand Prix gets underway, it's impossible to say for sure which teams will suffer the most. One thing is certain, though: the debate over flexible wings is far from over. With the FIA tightening the rules, the upcoming Chinese Grand Prix is shaping up to be a major test for teams on the grid. While some may have already adjusted their designs, others could struggle to regain lost performance due to the stricter rear-wing flex limits. One of the biggest questions heading into the race weekend is whether McLaren's straight-line speed advantage will take a hit. Will the MCL39 still be as dominant, or has this regulatory shift forced them to rethink their approach? Similarly, Ferrari might also face challenges given their history of aggressive aerodynamics. On the other hand, Red Bull could emerge as the biggest beneficiary of these changes. With their RB21 seemingly built to withstand these stricter regulations, they might have already anticipated this shift. If they maintain their edge while others falter, this could be another crucial step in securing an early advantage in the 2025 championship battle. Regardless of who gains or loses, one thing is clear: Formula One is a sport of constant evolution. As long as there are gray areas in the rules, teams will continue searching for ways to push the limits. And with the FIA proving that they're willing to take swift action, it's only a matter of time before the next controversy emerges. So, have Red Bull and the FIA won this battle? Or will teams like McLaren find a new way to fight back? The answers will unfold on the track in Shanghai. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to watch out for the drama unfolding at the Chinese Grand Prix.